The coat tore at the shoulder on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning it was mended so finely that the Duke of Alderleigh stood in his dressing room and simply stared at it for a full minute before he said a word to anyone. He had fallen from his horse the day before. Nothing dramatic. A hedge, a bad landing, a seam giving way at the shoulder with a sound like tearing paper. His valet had winced. His riding companions had laughed, the way men laugh when they're relieved someone isn't hurt. And the Duke himself had said nothing, because that was his way, but he had looked down at the torn wool with something close to grief. That coat was 7 years old. It had belonged to his father before it belonged to him, taken in at the shoulders, let out at the waist, worn through 2 continents and 1 funeral. It was not fashionable. It was not, by any reasonable standard, worth repairing. His valet had told him as much on more than one occasion, usually while holding it at arm's length, like something slightly distasteful. So when it appeared in his wardrobe the next morning, whole again, he assumed at first that his eyes were playing tricks on him. They were not. He lifted it from the hook and turned it toward the window, and the light did something to the shoulder seam that made his breath catch, just slightly, just for a moment. The stitches were so small they were barely visible. They followed the grain of the wool as though they had grown there, as though no violence had ever been done to the fabric at all. He had seen the work of London's finest tailors. He had a standing account with a man on Savile Row who charged accordingly and delivered adequately. This was not adequate. This was something else entirely. He asked his valet who had done it. His valet did not know. He asked the housekeeper, and she looked at him with the particular blankness of a woman who has decided, for reasons of her own, not to know something. He asked eventually nearly everyone in the house, and nearly everyone in the house found some reason to be looking at the floor when he asked. It took him 4 days to learn the truth, and he learned it by accident, the way most true things in that house seemed to arrive. He came down to the servants' hall earlier than expected, looking for a boot that had gone missing, and he saw her there in the corner by the window, where the light was best. A woman he had passed 100 times in the corridors without exchanging a single word. The seamstress. She had a coat across her lap that was not his, and a needle moving with a kind of quiet, unhurried precision that made everything else in the room seem clumsy by comparison. He did not say anything. He only watched, for longer than was strictly proper, the way her hand moved like it already knew where it was going before it got there. Later, he learned her name was Eleanor. Later still, he learned that she had asked no one's permission to mend his coat. She had simply seen it, torn and discarded on the chair where his valet had left it in disgust, and she had taken it, and she had fixed it, and she had put it back before morning, and she had told no one, because it had not occurred to her that it was the kind of thing a person needed credit for. He found this, more than anything else about her, unbearably interesting. He was a man not given to displays of feeling. He had been told this his whole life, by his mother, by his tutors, by at least one woman who had wanted more warmth from him than he had known how to produce. He had accepted it about himself the way a man accepts the shape of his own hands. It was simply how he was made. And yet here he was, 4 days into an investigation over a coat, standing in a servants' hall at an hour he had no business being there, watching a woman sew and feeling something move in his chest that he did not have a ready word for. He did not approach her that day. He told himself it was a matter of propriety. A duke did not simply walk into the servants' hall and strike up conversation with a seamstress, no matter how fine her stitches were, no matter how the morning light fell across her hands. There were structures to a house like his, rules that existed for reasons nobody quite remembered anymore, but existed all the same, load-bearing walls of a life he had not built, but had certainly inherited, along with the coat, along with everything else. So instead, he wore the coat. He wore it riding, and he wore it to inspect the tenant farms, and he wore it on the single occasion that autumn when he had gone to church out of obligation rather than faith. And every single time, without exception, he found his fingers drifting to the shoulder seam, tracing the place where the tear had been, where her hands had been, where something had been undone, and then, quietly, without ceremony, made whole again. His valet noticed, of course. His valet noticed everything, which was both the man's great virtue and his great irritation. "You might consider a new one, Your Grace," he said, some weeks later, holding the coat up to the light with the same look of mild distaste he'd worn since the day of the fall. "This one has had its day, more than its day if I'm honest." "It has been repaired," the Duke said.
"It has been mended," the valet corrected, with the precision of a man who took his profession seriously.
"There's a difference. Mending keeps a thing wearable. It doesn't make it new." The Duke took the coat from his hands and did not answer right away. He ran his thumb along the shoulder seam, the way he had taken to doing without quite noticing he did it. "I am aware of the difference," he said finally. The valet, wisely, did not pursue the matter further that day, but he brought it up again in December and again in February, each time with a fresh argument, each time meeting the same quiet refusal. By the third season, the coat was, by any objective measure, an embarrassment. The cuffs had worn thin. The color had faded unevenly, the way old wool does, patchy and strange in certain lights. Any other man of his rank would have consigned it to a groundskeeper or a bonfire a year prior. But the Duke could not do it. Every time he considered it seriously, every time he stood in front of the wardrobe with the intention of finally letting the thing go, his hand would find that seam, and something in him would simply refuse. He told himself it was sentiment for his father. That was the easier story, the one he offered his valet, the one he half offered himself in the privacy of his own head. But sentiment for his father had never before stopped him from disposing of the man's other effects. His boots, long gone, his hunting rifles, sold off within a year of the funeral, practical decisions made without agonizing. It was not his father he could not part with, it was her. He knew this, somewhere past the part of himself that managed to avoid knowing things he did not wish to know, and he suspected he had known it for some time. The trouble, of course, was that he had never spoken to her, not once, not directly, not in all the months since he'd first watched her sew in that corner by the window. He knew her name because he had asked the housekeeper, in a tone he had tried very hard to make casual, and had almost certainly failed. He knew she had come to the house 4 years prior, recommended by a family in the north whose circumstances had changed. He knew she kept to herself, ate her meals early, and had a reputation among the other staff for being exacting but fair, which was, he thought, about the highest compliment servants tended to pay one another. He knew, in other words, almost nothing at all, and everything that mattered. It was his sister who finally forced the matter, as sisters have a particular talent for doing. She came to stay in the spring of the 3rd year, restless from her own household and eager, as she always was, to find something in his life to comment upon. She found the coat within a day.
"Good heavens," she said at dinner, staring at him as though he'd arrived wearing a sack.
"Is that the same coat you had 2 years ago? The one that tore?" "It is." "It's practically falling apart, Edmund. It is held together admirably, all things considered. All things considered, it should be firewood." She set down her fork with the particular precision of a woman building toward a point. "Everyone is talking about it, you know. The Duke of Alderleigh, wearing a coat a stable boy would be ashamed of. People are starting to invent explanations. Mrs. Pargeter's theory, last I heard, is that you've fallen into some sort of financial difficulty and are too proud to admit it. Mrs. Pargeter has never required facts to sustain a theory. That isn't the point, and you know it." She studied him for a long moment, and he had the distinct sense, not for the first time in his life, that his sister could see directly through him in a way almost nobody else managed. "You've had opportunity enough to replace it. Every tailor in London would fall over himself for the commission. And yet—" She gestured at the coat, at the shoulder, at the seam he had once again, without noticing, begun to trace with his thumb. "There's a story here. There's always a story, with you, even when you'd rather there wasn't." He said nothing for a long moment, and the silence stretched out long enough that his sister's expression shifted from playful interrogation into something gentler, something that looked almost like concern. "It was mended," he said finally, "by someone in this house, without being asked. I don't know why it matters as much as it does, but it does." His sister's eyebrows lifted slowly. "Mended by whom?" He told her. "Not everything. Not the hours he'd spent turning it over in his mind, not the ridiculous frequency with which he found himself inventing reasons to walk past the servants' hall at the hour when the light was good, but enough. The bones of it. The coat, the tear, the silence, the seamstress whose name he'd had to extract from the housekeeper like a confession. His sister listened with an expression that grew steadily more delighted as he spoke, which he found faintly alarming.
"Edmund," she said, when he'd finished, "you astonish me."
"I fail to see what's astonishing about a coat."
"It isn't the coat that astonishes me." She leaned forward, and there was real warmth in her face now, past the teasing. "It's that you've noticed a woman, truly noticed her. I don't believe I've seen you do that in your entire adult life. You went through 2 entire seasons of eligible young ladies throwing themselves at you with all the enthusiasm of a man reviewing accounts. And now here you are, mooning over a seamstress's needlework like a boy with his first infatuation." "I am not mooning." "You are absolutely mooning." He opened his mouth to object further, found he had no honest objection to offer, and closed it again. His sister laughed, not unkindly, and reached across the table to pat his hand the way she had done since they were children, in the particular manner of an older sister delivering a truth her brother was too proud to arrive at himself. "Speak to her," she said. "For heaven's sake, Edmund, you're a duke. She's a seamstress in your own household, who spent 3 seasons quietly repairing your favorite coat and asking nothing in return. What precisely are you waiting for?" He did not have a good answer for that either, but her words settled into him over the following days the way certain truths do, slow and unglamorous, until by the end of the week he found he could not stop thinking about them. The trouble was that he did not know how to begin. He had never been a man of easy conversation, and the particular architecture of his household, the distances built into it, the walls of rank that had stood so long nobody thought to question them anymore, made the prospect of simply walking up to her and speaking feel, absurdly, like the most difficult undertaking of his life. He had negotiated with tenant farmers over disputed boundaries. He had sat across from men twice his age in matters of estate and inheritance, and held his ground without flinching. And yet, the idea of approaching a woman half his rank in his own servants' hall filled him with something close to dread. He managed it, in the end, because of the coat. It happened almost by accident, on an ordinary afternoon in early summer, when he came down the back stair to avoid a tedious visitor and found himself, not for the first time, near the room where she worked. The door stood partly open. He could hear the particular sound of her needle drawing through fabric, a small, rhythmic scrape that he had come, over the months, to recognize instantly. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. She was younger than he'd somehow imagined, though he had seen her often enough that this should not have surprised him. Her hair was pulled back plainly, a few strands escaping near her temple, and there was a directness in her gaze that he had not expected. No flinching, no immediate lowering of the eyes the way most of his staff managed when he appeared unannounced. She simply looked at him, waiting, her needle still between her fingers. "Your Grace," she said, and began to rise. "Please don't," he said, more quickly than he intended, and then, feeling foolish, "That is, you needn't stand on my account." She lowered herself back into her seat slowly, watching him with an expression he could not quite read. Curiosity, perhaps. Or wariness, likely both. "Is something wrong with your coats, Your Grace?" she asked, when the silence had stretched a beat too long. "I haven't been told of any repairs needed." "No," he said, "nothing is wrong." Another silence. He was aware, with a sharpness that embarrassed him, that he had rehearsed nothing, that he had walked into this room with no plan whatsoever, beyond the simple, overwhelming need to finally say something to her after 3 years of saying nothing at all. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally, "for the coat, the riding coat, the one that tore at the shoulder some years back." Something shifted in her face, not quite surprise, more like the particular stillness of a person who has been found out after believing herself thoroughly hidden. "I didn't think anyone would notice the difference," she said carefully. "It was old, torn wool, nothing so fine that the stitching would draw attention." "It drew attention," he said. "It drew a great deal of attention. My valet has been trying to convince me to discard that coat for 2 years,
and I find I cannot bring myself to do it. Because of my stitching." There was the faintest note of disbelief in her voice, as though the idea were slightly absurd to her. "Because of your stitching," he confirmed, "among other things." She held his gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and he found he did not mind in the least. "May I ask," he said, "why you did it? You had no obligation. No one asked you to. You might have left it exactly as it was, and no one would have thought the less of you." She set down the fabric in her lap, a plain length of muslin, some household linen in need of hemming, and considered the question with the same careful attention she seemed to bring to everything. "I saw it on the chair in the hall," she said, "torn like that. It seemed a waste, to let good wool go to ruin over one bad seam, and I suppose," she paused, choosing her words with visible care, "I suppose I like the idea of mending something that mattered to somebody. Most of what I repair in this house is linen nobody notices, sheets, petticoats, things that exist to be useful and forgotten. That coat was different. Anyone could see it had been loved. It seemed wrong to let it go for the sake of one tear." He found, to his own considerable surprise, that his throat had tightened. "It had belonged to my father," he said, "before it belonged to me." "I gathered as much," she said quietly. "The wear on the elbows was old, older than any of your other coats. It had the shape of a garment that had been someone's favorite for a very long time, and then someone else's after that." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman he had watched from doorways and corridors for 3 years, without ever once finding the courage to simply walk up and speak, and he thought, with a clarity that startled him, that he had never in his life met anyone who understood so precisely, with so little explanation required, exactly what a thing like that coat had meant to him. "I should have thanked you sooner," he said. 3 years is a long time to let a debt like that go unpaid." "It wasn't a debt, Your Grace," she said, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth now, something almost like amusement. "I didn't mend it expecting payment. I mended it because it needed mending, and I was the one who noticed." "All the same," he said, "I find I've thought of you, rather more often than a man in my position generally admits to thinking about anything." The words hung in the air between them, more honest than he had intended, and he watched her go very still, her hands folding quietly in her lap, her eyes searching his face for something he could not name. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am a seamstress in your household. I mend linens and hems and, apparently, the occasional coat. I don't know what you imagine might come of thinking about me." "Neither do I," he admitted. "I've had 3 years to consider it, and I remain entirely without a satisfactory answer. I only know that I have worn that coat through every season since, past the point of reason, past the point where any sensible man would have replaced it, because I could not bear to lose the one thing in this house that felt as though it had been mended with care rather than obligation." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It stretched out between them like something being carefully built, brick by brick, with neither of them entirely certain yet what shape it would take. "That's a great deal to admit," she said finally, "over a torn coat." "It was never only about the coat," he said. "I think we both understand that by now." She did not answer right away. When she did, her voice had softened into something quieter, something that carried the particular weight of a person choosing, deliberately, to be honest. "I noticed you too," she said, "long before the coat. You'd walk past this room some mornings, and I told myself it was only the light you were after, or some business with the household accounts. I didn't let myself think it might be anything else. It seemed presumptuous to imagine a duke might notice a seamstress at all, let alone for longer than it took to walk past a door." "I noticed," he said simply. "I noticed a great deal more than I let myself admit, for a great deal longer than I should have." He did not touch her. Propriety, even now, even in this moment that felt entirely unlike any other moment of his carefully governed life, held him back from that. But he stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine, careful lines around her eyes, close enough that the space between them felt charged with something neither of them was yet brave enough to name outright. "I don't know what convention allows for a man in my position and a woman in yours," he said quietly. I imagine there are a great many people who would tell me this is impossible. Improper. A duke does not go courting his household seamstress, whatever her talents. No, she agreed, I imagine there are a great many people who would say exactly that. I find, he said, that I have grown considerably less interested in what a great many people would say. Something in her expression broke open then, some careful restraint she had been holding since the moment he'd appeared in her doorway, and for the first time since he'd known of her, watched her, thought of her in 100 quiet, unspoken ways. She looked at him without any wariness at all. Then perhaps, she said, you ought to bring me that coat again sometime. I could look it over properly. I suspect the cuffs want mending too, by now. They do, he said, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been wound tight for longer than he cared to admit. They have wanted mending for the better part of a year, and I have refused every offer to have it done, because I could not bear the thought of anyone's hands on it but yours. She laughed then, softly, and it was the first time he had heard the sound, and he thought immediately that he wanted to hear it again as often as he possibly could for the rest of whatever years he had left to arrange. Bring it to me tomorrow, she said. I'll see what can be done. He did bring it the following morning, and the morning after that he found reasons to bring other things as well. A torn cuff on a lesser coat, a missing button. Excuses so thin his valet began to look at him with open and undisguised amusement, though he was wise enough, this time, to say nothing at all about it. The visits grew longer. The silences between them grew easier, filled less with careful propriety and more with the particular comfortable quiet of two people who had already said the difficult things and found, on the other side of them, something worth continuing toward. His sister, when she heard of it, and she heard of it within a fortnight because servants talk and sisters listen more closely than anyone gives them credit for, arrived at his townhouse with an expression of such profound satisfaction that he very nearly turned her away at the door. I told you, she said, settling into a chair without waiting to be asked. I told you to speak to her. You did, he admitted. And I find, he said slowly, choosing each word with the same care he had once reserved only for matters of estate and law, that I intend to marry her, if she'll have me, and if the whole of London chooses to be scandalized by it, I find myself remarkably unbothered by the prospect. His sister did not look surprised. She looked, if anything, as though she had been waiting for precisely this announcement since the day she'd first noticed the state of his coat. Well, she said, it took you 3 seasons and a great deal of ruined wool to get there. But I suppose better late than never. He could not entirely disagree. The wedding, when it came, was smaller than convention dictated and larger than either of them had originally intended. Because it turned out a surprising number of people wished to witness a duke marry a seamstress out of nothing but genuine and uncomplicated affection, whatever gossip had circulated in the months prior. His sister stood beside Eleanor at the front of the church, radiant with a satisfaction that bordered on smugness, and his valet, standing near the back with the particular dignity of a man who has served faithfully and long, wore an expression that might, in another man, have been mistaken for tears. The coat itself, mended now so many times over that it was, by any reasonable measure, more thread than original wool, hung in his wardrobe still, retired at last, not because he had finally listened to reason, but because Eleanor herself had gently suggested it might be time. It's done its work, she told him, the week after the wedding, running her fingers over the old shoulder seam one final time. It brought you to me. I think it's earned its rest. He kept it anyway, folded carefully in a chest at the foot of their bed, and some years later, when their daughter was old enough to ask about the strange old coat that never seemed to be worn but was never thrown away either, he told her the story of the tear and the mending and the 3 seasons he had refused, against all sense and every argument his valet could produce, to let go of a woman's careful, quiet kindness. His daughter, listening with the particular seriousness of a child hearing something she does not yet fully understand, but senses is important, asked him what had made the stitching so special. He thought about it for a long moment before he answered. She didn't have to do it, he said finally. Nobody asked her to. She simply saw something broken and decided on her own that it deserved to be whole again. I don't think I had ever, in my whole life up to that point, met anyone who did that without being asked. It seemed to me the finest thing a person could do for another person. I have thought so ever since. His daughter considered this with the grave attention of a child filing away a truth for later use, and then she went off to find her mother, who was, as she so often was in those years, seated by the window where the light was best, needle moving with the same quiet, unhurried precision that had first caught a duke's attention across the width of a servants' hall, all those seasons ago, back when neither of them had yet found the courage to say a single word to the other, and everything that mattered between them still lay folded and waiting, like a torn seam, for someone brave enough to mend it. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. I'd love to know what you felt while listening. Was it the coat that got you, or the quiet courage of a woman who mended something without ever asking for credit? Let me know in the comments which moment stayed with you longest, and tell me which city you're watching from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories like it. Until then, from all of us here, good night and sweet dreams.